volunteers here to introduce themselves. If Kel and William, do you mind just going back one slide, Azad? Yeah, Kel and William, would you both like to just introduce yourselves and some of the accessibility and language considerations?
Go ahead, William.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is William. I'm going to be one of the Spanish interpreters for today. Before we start, I'm going to give short instruction on how to access the interpretation channel that's going to appear shortly. Esta reunión será en inglés y en español y habrá interpretación simultánea. Para utilizar la función de interpretación, en breve aparecerá un globo en la parte inferior de su pantalla. Lo presiona y escogerá su idioma, sea inglés o sea español. Si habla los dos, puede quedarse en el canal principal y si no, pues puede escoger uno. Si está utilizando un teléfono móvil o un smartphone, presione más los 3 puntos suspensivos y presione interpretación de idiomas y escoja su lenguaje. No olvide darle clic para que se active. This meeting will be in English and Spanish with simultaneous interpretation. To listen to the interpretation, if you're using a computer, press the globe that will appear shortly at the bottom of your screen and select your language. If you're using a smartphone app, look for the 3 dots that say more, click on it and choose the language interpretation, choose language and click done. Thank you, we're ready. You can assign us as interpreters. Have a good one today.
Gracias. Thank you for that. And Kel, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Kel. I use they and them pronouns. I am one of the tech volunteers from the AMC, calling in from Detroit. I just wanted to go over a couple of accessibility features on Zoom today. So we do have the interpretation, which should be live now. If you click on that globe, like William said. We also have the live auto captioning enabled. So if you click on that more ... button, you should be able to view the subtitles if that is helpful to you. The chat is enabled, so please feel free to post questions, concerns, comments, anything regarding Zoom or other AMC things. Feel free to send me a private message if you prefer. And I think that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, feel free to use the chat at any point and kind of engage with anything really, and we can kind of always come back to that. But yeah, thank you both for helping us as well with this presentation. We really appreciate that. So without further ado, we can introduce those of us on the panel. And I will just encourage the faceless people here to turn on their camera for anyone who might be able to or comfortable. It would be great to see who else is here in the room with us, but of course, no pressure. Thank you. Okay, yeah, so we can go to the next slide, Azad, please. Awesome. So yeah, we can introduce ourselves. Who's on the panel here in the room? Reina, would you like to kick us off?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking your time to be here with us today as we give our presentation. My name is Reina Abston from Missouri, the Show Me state. And so I have been an advocate of tenants' rights for over 25 years. So please thank you for taking the time to be here and allow us to educate you on what we know.
Hi, Azad Emriksemi. I'm a member of the Los Angeles branch of the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, and pass to Brett.
Everyone, my name is Brett. I also originally joined the New York City chapter of the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, and I am now based in Seattle, and I am a designer and researcher part of the project. And Lisa?
Hi, everyone. My name is Lisa Yakubchik. I'm affiliated with the New York City chapter. I'm also based in New York City, and I work as a designer and developer for the project. Pass it over to Luis.
Hi, everyone. I'm Luis Trujillo. I started with the project a couple of years ago. I can't really remember anymore. First in LA, I'm now in New York, but I was born and raised in LA and still do anti-displacement work with my collective. We've been doing it since 2014 in Northeast Los Angeles.
Awesome.
All right, so we wanted to also begin with a bit of a content warning. A lot of the things that we'll be talking about are, the experiences of abuse, harassment, retaliation, generally housing precarity, things that have the potential to be traumatizing or re-traumatizing and triggering. So just, if you need to take a step back or, step away, please feel, listen to your body. But yeah, we just wanted to make sure that people are prepared for that as we progress. Okay, so a little bit of a brief introduction to the COVID-19 Story Project. I believe we'll be talking about other projects, specifically a Victor book and other things that AMP is engaged in. But the whole presentation will go into more detail about all of the aspects of what we do and what this project helps to accomplish. But just to sort of tease it a little bit, this project in and of itself, you see the people here, it's a small fraction of the amount of individuals and the amount of labor that it took to get this thing up and running. Dozens and dozens of people, all volunteer based, nobody's getting paid, everybody's putting in their time because they're really committed to our overarching imperative, ethical imperative, which is housing justice. AMP is a housing justice collective organization, not affiliated with any institution. But with that in mind, and Azad will again cover this in more detail in the slides to follow, the origins of AMP have always been participatory action research, where research begets action and action itself also begets research. So our work is always about being connected to folks on the ground, to other organizations who also work in housing justice, if that includes nonprofits or grassroots collectives. It's about working with tenants, tenant unions, buildings and strikes, anybody committed to at any level or scale to housing justice. And so AMP has been doing this work for many years, since 2013, as Azad again will cover in more detail. But sorry, still doing the introduction. So what this project itself is born from is years and years of AMP work, specifically in the Bay Area, moving into Los Angeles, and then we have a chapter also in New York, where the experience of the pandemic was coupled with the epidemic of a lack of stable, secure, and affordable housing, particularly for the most precarious and most vulnerable populations of our city. So when the pandemic hit, it was an exacerbation of a health crisis that we have been feeling for many, many years now. Again, that public health crisis being in access to stable housing. So the first iterations of this project were at various scales and scopes, global to local, but all in all, to capture the tenant experience under COVID-19, of how that continuum of struggle evolved under the COVID-19 context and how it progresses to this day. So like I said, we'll be covering a lot more about what this project entails, the methods and methodologies we employ, but that's just a little tease into what the project is all about. Next slide, please. So a little bit of the overview today. We did our introductions. Reina will follow up with talking about housing justice and tenant rights and why we do the work that we do. Azad will continue with that, with talking about the origins of AMP, Anti-Eviction Mapping Project. From that, we'll get into the project itself, the COVID-19 Mapping Project, and discuss the various aspects of it and all the moving parts and all the labor and people that it took to put it together. We'll go through the successes and challenges that we experienced. We'll do a little bit of a listening party to some of the stories that we collected. And then we really want to just kind of open it up to conversation, have an open forum. We are building the plane as we fly, as most people say. So it's always great to get feedback, to have outside perspectives, or even if folks are interested in joining us, we're always taking new volunteers all the time. So if you're interested in the work that we do, please feel free to reach out to us afterwards. But yeah, we would love to hear your feedback after this is all concluded. So I'll pass it over to Raina to talk about why we do what we do.
Hi, everyone. My name is Raina Abston. I'm with the Raleigh Renters Association. I've been a tenants' rights advocate for over 25 years. And so I do what I do because no one else was doing it at the time. You know, in the 90s, there was no resources. There were no databases. There weren't phone numbers you can call. There weren't any commercials on the TV screen that said, tenants, come here for help. Next slide. So what I am working on is Show Me Lives Matter. Show Me Lives Matter comes from the actual understanding that Missouri is the show me state. And having been done this for 25 years, I offer a glimpse of experience that what you may not have if you're new to activism work or maybe even research. And if you look at the pictures, the Show Me Lives Matter is actually people, because that's what it's all about, the people and going out to the people. So if you notice, I'm in my vehicle because this is real life for me being in a vehicle going out to the people. I'm sitting on the parking lot of a courthouse because this is also real life for people, that they come and walk through the doors that are behind me and it changes their lives forever. So Show Me Lives Matter, this whole presentation, bringing it together for me, and thank you for the invitation to be a speaker, allows me to give you a little insight of what it was like back in 1998. Next slide. The picture that you see here is of an actual eviction in St. Louis. It occurred around 2015. However, I'm speaking on why I began this back in 1998, because the same picture that you see was happening back in 1998. And now it's 2022, and we're still seeing the same pictures. In this particular picture, this was an actual case that my association did. It went all over the news. It was 3925 Greer, St. Louis, Missouri. Now, if you read the articles about the case, you won't see my name. You won't see anything about me. But I literally started the whole case. So in my hand, I'm holding a sleeve of 3925 Greer. The tenants, if you read these articles, actually won their case. They did. But if you meet the tenants and ask them what did they win, their answer is not going to be as fluffy as these articles in the media. That's also a pattern of how media takes our cases and our lives and turns it into showcases for people to see. But behind closed doors, the public really never knows what happens to the tenants once the lights go off and it's over. Did the tenants get any justice? Did they get any money back? Were they unevicted? Did they get to move back into the property? Did the landlord go to jail? Did anything actually happen beyond getting on the news? Many times the answer is no. And sadly to think, those people made the news. How many people don't? And do they get relief most of the time? No, that is the pattern. Even though we may have been highlighted, did something happen to help us? Not at all. Next slide, please. In this slide, this tenant was being evicted from a house in the city of St. Louis on the north side that didn't have an occupancy permit. The house was in horrible, horrible conditions. But see, he's smiling. He actually won. That is rare for a tenant to actually win in courts. If you understand the volume of tenants that is on a docket, usually at 9 o'clock in the morning and 1 o'clock in the afternoon, there could be anywhere from 15 to 40 people, sometimes more, per docket. If you've ever been through an eviction, you know through experience, from the time you get served your paper to the time you're in court is about 3 weeks or less. 3 weeks, 21 days, give or take. So I need advocates, if you've never been through it, to hear what I said. 3 weeks, 21 days. If your work is not set up to fit that time frame, that curriculum, you cannot help people that is being evicted. Why? Because that's all the time that they have. This man who won his case actually had the time to move. But usually if you're evicted, you only have a set amount of time to move. In Missouri, they can give you as little as 24 hours. Do you know what it is in your state? Next slide. This is an article that many people go through in situations. They move into properties that are uninhabitable and have safety concerns. How common? Have you ever experienced an electrical hazard in a place that you rented? Has your roof ever leaked? Has it ever been infested with bugs? Have you ever had major structural problems and the landlord still wants his rent every 30 days? Next slide. There are laws that are supposed to protect us, and it's called habitability laws. And if they're not enforced, that is how a tenant can be placed in a house with hazardous conditions and nothing is ever done. Those circumstances happen all the time. And when tenants complain, tenants usually are evicted. But wait, I thought that's what the laws were for, was to protect us. But if there is no one enforcing the law, then the tenant is caught in a catch-22. Many times, that is what happens to many tenants. You have 21 days to try to figure out how to handle an eviction that you know nothing about. How many of you know the laws and policies? How many? Because many people don't. And without understanding and learning the laws and policies locally, you don't know how to defend yourself when it comes to court. In an article that is written, there was a 2014 inspection that took place. And it talked about the live wires being exposed, not having adequate heat. It even talked about the eviction notice not being the proper standard. The eviction notice. So if the eviction notice wasn't written legal and proper, that would make it illegal, correct? Do you know how many illegal notices of evictions are written every day and people are taken through the court process under illegal notices all the time. Next slide, please. In Missouri, most of the people who own property and real estate are also our lawmakers. Are you looking that up in your state? Do you look up and see who are your property owners? Do you look up and see what clubs or organizations your property owners and landlords may be involved in? Because in Missouri, they are the property owners. Shouldn't we understand that that's a conflict of interest? Yes, that these people are making the laws that govern them and make it worse upon the tenant. But we allow that every day. If people in different states would do the work and look up, who are your mayors, your city council? Are they property owners? You'll find out many of them are. And that's the problem. Because the people that you're supposed to go to and complain are the ones literally the owners of the properties. And we allow it to happen every day. So as laws make it through, the public does not unionize themselves enough to be able to stop the laws that are coming down the pipes. Many times we don't even have a clue of what's even going on, and that needs to change. We need to be more proactive. Next slide, please. In the case of a person being thrown out, let's say the person or the people's property that you saw out in the yard, do you think that they will ever get a new trial? Do you think if they're illegally evicted, someone is going to step in and start the process all over again? No, not at all. And that's the problem. There's nothing in place to stop these people, to keep them from enduring and continuing these evictions. Why? Because they're doing them illegally. If you are an activist and you don't understand what illegal means, that is the problem as well. As tenants, we're caught between an intersection of ignorance and cruelty. Cruelty for the people who are doing it to us, and the ignorance of the people who don't know how to help us. In your state, you need to learn what your ordinances, what your laws are. So here in St. Louis, for example, they need to have an occupancy permit to legally allow the tenant to occupy the property. Guess what? Most rental properties don't even have an occupancy permit. So let's try to understand that in real time. If I was a driver, and I am, if I didn't go and get my driver's license, they would say I was driving illegally, and someone would definitely step in once they knew. But these are property owners who's been driving these tenants into these properties that don't have occupancy permits, and it's been happening for years. See, that's what the word disparity means. It means when there's a difference in reaction, when in reality, it should be the same. So tenants are literally renting buildings that are technically and legally condemned and then being evicted. Eviction laws, ideally and legally, they were written for a house to at least meet a certain standard of habitability. They weren't meant to be written on houses that were below a standard or slum property. That's not what it was meant nor written for. However, through society, we've allowed that to become the norm. So I don't have to follow the law. I don't have to go get an occupancy permit. I don't have to get the property inspected because I can still rent and not get in trouble. So that brings me to the next point, that big point. What about all these judgments and people who are being evicted illegally that didn't have an occupancy permit, or maybe their notice was illegal. How do we help them? By simply understanding why the notice was illegal. So in Missouri, they have to give you at least 10 days. If a notice is only 48 hours, 5 days, 7 days, 3 days, that means that notice fails the standard of law, and that would be an illegal eviction. If everyone did that across the state, just on that one premise of a notice, you could overturn all these evictions, and you'll understand it's illegal because the notice did not meet the standard of law. Or if you understand the fact that the house is below a standard, which makes it uninhabitable, that eviction should be overturned. Why? Because the house wasn't to a standard to even be rented in the first place. You see? How you understand one thing, you can go forward, you can go backwards. And all these court judgments in the end, they should be overturned, which means no more judgments, no more garnishment. That means not being on any more tenant screening companies, because now you're completely denied. You see how if you understand one thing, how you can undo and overturn everything that we talk about that never gets done? Get it? See, that's our 25 years of experience. I can go forward, I can go back. But you must be able to understand it, to be able to utilize it. So I thank everyone for giving me your time, because many people do not win their cases. But if we can bring enough people together that wants to learn off of cases that have already been collected, many times this has happened in your state too. And you need this paperwork because you can't help them. You can't defeat anything and you can't overturn. But once you collect, now you can help, you can heal, you can lead avenues to be created. This can be a new industry of overturning people's judgments and removing certain barriers from their credit report and their lives. Could be the Christmas gift of 2022. Thank you so much for giving me the time. I'm Raina Abston of the Raleigh Renters Association.
Thank you, Raina. I'm going to introduce now the anti-eviction mapping project. So that's the reality in every state and every city, that the courts and the system is set up for the benefit of the landlord class, because the landlord class is the ruling class. I mean, if you go all the way up to, say, Gavin Newsom in California, he's a scion of the largest landowners in the state. So the anti-eviction mapping project itself, it functions as an intermediary between renters, between actual people, tenant unions and tenants on the ground, and the work that those people need or want to get done, to get information about how the housing justice movement itself organizes or can organize. So we use technology. We use technology, mapping, and stories to get stories about tenants and the tenant movement to the public. So if you go to our website, you can see we have lots of projects. I'm going to run through these pretty quickly, but because we're volunteer-based, people drop in to work on a specific project, and they or to make a map, or to make stories, and they'll drop out. So there are tons of projects depending on areas and on the topic, both from policing to illegal renters to just telling people, getting people to understand what evictions are. We started in 2014 and 2015 as part of the San Francisco Tenant Union, where at that time, like people didn't even believe that evictions or displacement were happening. So I mean, when we talk about like, people know evictions happen, and because they have, if an eviction happens to you, it has drastic traumatic effects on you. But if you're of a certain class, then like this change that happens in cities, when we talk about displacement and gentrification, this kind of happens below your noticing, below your understanding. So some of the tools that were made are meant to show to certain people, certain lawmakers, certain classes of people in our cities, like what's actually happening underneath the surface of capital and real estate. So we were involved in some of the original bus protests against technology companies. They were like really misreported as being like, oh, we're against tech companies, but really it was about like, no, these tech companies are driving change and driving changes in displacement in communities. And now they've gone from San Francisco to like, tech companies are now expanding themselves because of housing costs into Austin, into the Research Triangle, into Los Angeles, into lots of cities. So like the things that start in San Francisco like go everywhere. So the kinds of technology that's used by real estate companies goes everywhere. And we've kind of been tracking this technology and these groups. So this is when we talk about politicians being landlords, this is a map of just one giant real estate serial evictor in San Francisco. And when you look at who are parts of these LLCs that they hide behind, and now LLCs and giant corporations that are buying both apartment buildings and single family homes, they're part of the political class. So you just look who's behind the LLCs, who are on the boards. They're politicians. So it's pretty small here, but it instantly goes into the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, because the wealthy class know each other. Our first map was really it might be the most important thing we made, was just this map of Ellis Act evictions in San Francisco that shows like where the evictions started, how many evictions happen. So take a look at that. It's an animated map. And then we've gone from that online work to making murals, making art, making these are just stencils of places that evictions happen, to take that online representation and bring it back to reality. We've also tracked eviction, like the evictors. This is something that we do all the time, is putting names and shaming like the biggest people who are profiting off of evictions, and then telling stories of who's evicted. So bearing witness to evictions. So like anytime you see like, piles of people's things in a yard, like that's an eviction, that there's a story behind it. There's a story of that person living in a house. This is some murals, and we just released a book. And so from here, now we're going to go into sorry, this is just some more work. Just to highlight one other project that we've been doing, because that now as we're getting bigger, we are undertaking these bigger projects, and the COVID map is one. This other project that we're doing is called Evictor Book, and it's automating this uncovering of who's behind LLCs, who are hidden, and then what have they done. So we are for San Francisco, and we're expanding to Oakland and other cities. We're trying to show what happened in a place, who did what in a place, and what else have they done. So you can actually look up to see like what kinds of behaviors has an owner done, if you don't know who your landlord is, because sometimes like there's no name on that rental slip. It's an LLC, it's a corporation. You don't know who owns it. You don't know what other properties they own. If people want to do a rent strike, it helps to know like who the other buildings are, what the other buildings are, so you can get in contact with those people to collectively actually, like if you wanted to actually get your demand met, you have to like hit them in the pocketbook, and that means knowing how much money they're pulling in, how much money they owe, like and what other properties or what other tenants you need to connect with. So that's the purpose of the Evictor Book. It's driven by the needs of the tenants, because we were doing this research manually, and and for a lot of people, and then it's been a multi-year project to make this into something that everyone can use, and that it can be available for everyone at a large scale. So maybe there's some politics of getting people to not do things, but really this is to aid tenant organizing because it was asked of us. Okay, so we're going to get into our story map and protection map, which is what this the rest of this session is going to be about. And I'm going to pass to Brett or
Luis.
Luis.
Yes, it's me. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about the oral history collection and curation process. So you can move to the next slide. There we go. Yeah, so as I was stating earlier, we are very much engaged in the practice of participatory action research. As Assad was highlighting, the work of AMP, its origins are in responding to on-the-ground situations. The various, in San Francisco, it's the tech booms, the .com booms that have been hitting that place for decades, and has resulted in an accelerated type of displacement that is tech-led. Reina spoke about her context, and I'm speaking from Los Angeles, and we have just 3 chapters right now, but in each of those chapters, we're engaged with the broader movements in those cities, in those places. And again, that's a variety of individuals, nonprofits, institutional, non-institutional actors, grassroots collectives, a matrix of relations that are political, social, cultural, your neighbors, people you grew up with. It's people engaged in the movement, right? It's folks doing advocacy work at the highest level of the state government or the city government, right? It's this larger matrix that we operate within, and that we also try to leverage in our work, right? So we make tools that are useful for organizers, for activists, that are useful for tenants. We do things that highlight the complexity of the tenant experience, right? That empowers them, and it's not only a means of kind of just showcasing their trauma or their hardships, right? So our sort of intention with this project specifically, as I was talking about, we operate in these various scopes and scales. Again, we're limited to our 3 chapters, but because of COVID-19 and the sort of like having been thrown to like a digital environment and doing everything digitally, we're all sort of we were all sort of sheltering in place at this time while we were doing this project. I think I'm starting to forget that how all of this was like virtual, but life is still kind of virtual. But through that, we were able to connect with other movements. Like I said, the first iterations of the project were global in scope, looking at housing justice actions that were happening in India, in Italy, across Europe, in Latin America, and this was all popularly sourced, right? People were bringing their stories to us, and we were mapping these stories to show, right, how as these things were happening to us, and as we were engaged in these things locally, as we have been, we also recognize that this is happening all over the world. Of course, we know that COVID-19 was impacting everybody all over the world, but that housing struggles principally were something that multiple people and different geographies were engaged in. And so that matrix of relations became much more broad, and the connections were starting to become fostered there. But in regards to kind of bringing it back to the oral history, kind of humanizing, attempts to humanize and portray the complexity of the tenant experience, we very much wanted to kind of create this opportunity to highlight, to showcase, to give platform for people to speak and to speak their own truth, but to also feel empowered in that speaking, right? So it's a practice of empathetic listening, but it's also to, in that conversation, to attach people to us and to this larger matrix of relations that is a housing justice movement, a global housing justice movement, right? So like the mapping of that oral history was very intentional, right? Because it brings them in this in a virtual way, but also like we try to connect people in material ways by like connecting them to resources, right? That's one of the things that we also do, to connect them to like people in their areas who are working on this, other tenants who are on rent strike or doing eviction blockades or are squatting, right? Like we're mapping this so that people know what's going on around them, what's going on in their local context as well as around the world. But we want this to be empowering ultimately, right? We want them to feel empowered, to not feel isolated, as COVID-19 made people feel very isolated in their moments, as an eviction makes you feel very isolated in that moment, right? To connect people and to have them feel that sense of solidarity that we were hoping to bring in our conversations with them, right? So that empowerment also goes into the methodology of our work, right? We do a double consent process, and we make sure that we're always consistent and transparent in our communication. We always orient things around the narrator and what they want, right? We ask them our questions. Of course, the scope is very focused, housing justice and what housing justice means to them, what their experience is with housing and COVID-19 and housing. But everything, we always, from the beginning, in the middle, and in the end, we always say, if it doesn't suit your story, then it doesn't work for us either, right? So we make sure that we're consenting from beginning to middle to end. We're getting their consent before we interview, while we're interviewing, and anything that we produce from the interview. And so, yeah, ultimately, it's about letting the narrator speak, about letting them tell their truth, and then connecting that truth to other truths in this very guided way, right? Because it's all about housing justice for us. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Next person.
Okay, sorry, I lost my muting screen. So the other side of, okay, so one part of the map is mapping and presenting those oral histories. So the other side was that we wanted to visualize and map rent strikes and, well, rent strikes, rental actions, and global policy responses. And so this turned out to be a pretty big undertaking, because not only did we need to do research on policies that were at city, county, global, city, county, national, state, and international, including all those localities in international countries. We had to do research on, we had to map them and present that data. And at the beginning of the crisis, we saw that there was a need, and there was a lot of volunteer effort to do that. So there was a lot of crowdsourcing of like the first kinds of policies that were emergency housing policies that went into. It became a little more complicated because there were emergency policies that came from courts, emergency policies that came from executive branches, and emergency policies that came from legislative, and eventually there were emergency policies that came from other kinds of bodies like the CDC. So we had to translate all of that data into a framework for mapping, for visualizing, and then for presenting it to people and making it easily findable for people. Because if you live in a city, are you covered by that state policy? Are you covered by the county policy? Are you covered by the locality? If you're in unincorporated Los Angeles, you don't have Los Angeles city policy. So this is like pretty complicated policy environments that everyone has to go through without being an expert in say like how the administrative systems of this country or other countries work. So it was a continuous process of that research, mapping it, getting that information, working with other people to see like other groups to see if this was helpful for them, and then reintegrating that into new versions of the maps, which required new development and new development, because we literally had to make a new version of a map to do this, because most GIS maps don't try to do both a local and a global thing at the same time. It's just a hard problem. So it's essentially to go from like 500 policies that change over time, that expire, that have been updated. We had to create a process of modeling them. So we went from at first a crowdsourced map response to creating categories for the different policies, like how strong were the policies. We had to structure like the idea, like so we had to become experts in the different types of policies that were happening. We had to create a process internally for taking that data and then ingesting it and having it into a computerized form. So like even that is a big thing. So we had to create forms to normalize any kind of data into something. Then we had to map it and to inform the public about it. So the map itself was a public, and we had to get the map out to individuals and hope that it was helpful for them. And eventually, like we saw that the same data was in other places. So yeah. We kept having to redo it, and so we started with like a Google form, which is a very simple way of doing a survey, and it doesn't give you a lot of process. So there's a lot of like data cleanup that has to be done on the back end. So as people would, we tried to have it as crowdsourced as possible. We tried to have it as with as much language justice as possible, but this introduces new issues where a simple survey becomes very complicated, and because there's like three or four languages for one question, and so Google Forms like didn't really like meet our needs. Like we wanted this to be as accessible to people at a global level, like add more languages, and we hit some edges for like what could be done with the most simple tool. So we made a new survey using Airtable, which is another. It allowed us to have like multiple different kinds of surveys that would feed into like the same database. It helped with this cognitive overload, but as our survey got more complicated, it became more complicated for people to work on. So it was no longer crowdsourced. We would take information from people as they submitted it, and then do the research and then put it in a form, which was really a data ingestion form at that point. So things that got more complicated for the needs of the map made the crowdsourcing more difficult. So, right, so it increased the labor for volunteers in the group instead of like distributing that everywhere. And I think crowdsourcing is it's fine and good, but it comes with these like operational costs that have to be optimized. Eventually, we started scoring the map, scoring the policies. So like we gave points for different things. Like this was, we sent this out to tenant groups, we sent it out to lawyers, we sent it out to be like, does this make sense to you? Like, would you grade something more or less? Because again, these policies were done in different ways. There were like attempts to make weaker policies, right? So you'd have to provide proof that you had COVID to get protections. You had to get a doctor's note. You had to do, as time went on, like you had this rush to do stronger policies, and then even places that had strong policies like walked them back and made them more landlord friendly, right? So any kind of organizing, and we'll get to this later, like real estate organizes very hard. And even doing this process of taking something qualitative and making it into a number, making it into a quantitative figure, like introduces costs. Like what are you reducing? Okay. So eventually we could like we could map, say, like who had the strongest policies, who had the weakest policies. Did this make sense? Like some of this like made sense from us from like just like a normalized level, but like where did this lead to? Like did an area that had weak policies ever get pushed to having stronger policies? I don't think they did. Like what did this serve as an organizing framework? Okay. And we'll get more into that stuff in the challenges, but I think I'm going to pass over to Brett on the design and development.
Thank you, Azad. Yes, so kind of as the previous people I've spoken to, as Reina, Luis, and Azad have kind of all touched on these long histories of the networks that really make up this whole entire eviction and housing precarity structure. And just as those structures are very much feeding into a lot of these issues, it raises these questions around like, what does it even mean to counter map these issues? Like, what is counter mapping? How do we design a counter map? What is the counter map? If we make our map in the tradition and histories of a lot of these issues, and we reproduce these colonial style maps, or we reproduce the methods in terms of design and the way that these colonial maps look and feel, and the ways that they ascribe these colonial labels to their maps, like, are we really making a counter map? And so counter mapping is a rich tradition that has followed long histories of land theft that goes back to indigenous land theft and indigenous oral histories that emerged as one way to document a lot of these injustices. And so very much trying to follow in these traditions and think about alternative ways of representing information, alternative ways of documenting a lot of these power structures and the realities of them. And so that kind of feeds into what it means to design a map like this. And so for us, the design process was not, we didn't want to reproduce a lot of the typical design methods that are often used in map making or often used in technology projects. And so for us, we followed a community-based design process, which means that very much in line with community organizing, we drew on our values and principles there to form a design process that was participatory, a design process that involved members of our communities, tenants, community organizers, people who are trying to influence policy, bringing them into this map making process to figure out what should this map be. And if we go to the next slide, please, we can see that this first was the very first materialization of the map. It started in March 2020. It was just a team of a few mostly researchers and developers who really quickly made this map when we started seeing the influx of COVID information. And we said, okay, how can we just start tracking what's happening? It initially started out with the US scope because our chapters are primarily based in New York City, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. And so we didn't really ever anticipate this becoming a global project. But as we were also working with our community partners in Romania, Italy, Brazil, other places around the world, it started growing in nature and in scope, especially as the eviction crisis itself started to intensify. And as Reina spoke to, a lot of states didn't even have protections. Like, sure, all these protections were emerging in, some more liberal cities, right, that had some protections. And that's where Azad's ranking scheme came into play, where we said, if we move on to the next slide, you can see kind of some of the ways that we transformed this map, which is where we started moving away from that other color scheme and toward a more sequential color scheme. And if we move to the next slide, you can get a closer look. Where we essentially rated the intensity of the protections, because some places had relatively more protections. And that's not to say that these protections were good or sufficient or enforced or really did what they were supposed to do. But still, comparatively speaking, some places offered better protections, while some places offered none, or some places offered maybe somewhere in between, but they weren't actually enforced. And so a lot of tenants were undergoing some really traumatizing experiences. And so that's where we also had oral historians working in parallel to start collecting the stories. But at this stage, this was still in, I want to say, around like June, July 2020. We were mostly mapping and tracking the different forms of legislation and the housing justice actions or coalitions that we're building around the world. And so what you can even just see here through the aesthetic is that we do not put the colonial labels in plain sight. We don't really like those labels. We don't really believe in those territories or borders, but there is still this tension where the policy protections exist within them. And so we added like a search bar for a way to people retrieve their information, but the representations themselves do not seek to reinforce a lot of that colonial labeling and land theft. But at the same time, we wanted to make the map usable so that people could find the policies that they needed to. And so the counter mapping design process was involved in bringing in people to give us feedback so that we could then install values into this map that would make it usable, make it accessible. We had people translating it in up to 12 different languages. We also even had to make it work. If we move to the next slide, we can see that we had to make it work on pocket computers because we have people, especially outside the US, who are increasingly accessing this information on mobile phones first. And so that also called for like reconfiguring the whole design itself to be compatible with those processes. And so really it came down to these emerging design principles that we gathered by showing the map to tenants, asking people to test it, asking people like to come into the collaborative design process with us and be part of this like co-creative map making. And that's where we, had these different interventions in the community-based design process where we figured out how to make it usable, how to make it accessible, how we could be more critically conscious of the politics and the moral dilemmas that go into a lot of this map making when we have these colonial borders and we still at the same time we exist within them, and we had a lot of limitations in terms of like what tools were even available to us in our really small team. This was not a large team. We had volunteers kind of come in and out of the project at different points in time, but that even itself presented a lot of challenges in terms of onboarding or training people and then who might lead the project. And so there were ongoing challenges that we'll actually get into in a little bit. But if we go to the next slide, we can see here that as the oral historians work to collect the stories, we then had this question of like, how do we map all of this stuff? So we have the legislation, we have the housing justice actions, we have the stories, and then as the policies were expiring, we now have eviction information. And so this was all under the COVID-19 era, which really just surfaced the housing crisis that was already there. It might seem like COVID made the housing crisis, but really it just brought it to the forefront and just made it so much worse than it already was. And then at that point, even a lot of people who were totally oblivious to it or just not really concerned about it had to kind of come to terms with it. And so we wanted to keep all the COVID related information, since this is just one project in a much larger project, in one place. And so what we did was we designed this kind of 2-tab system where, as the links I put in the chat, like one tab has what started out as that protections map and the policies and housing justice actions. And then the other tab is where we have the oral stories that we'll get into a little bit more. And then they are situated next to the eviction information so that the two can contextualize one another. Because often what happens in a lot of map making projects or what you might see in a place like Eviction Lab at Princeton University is that they really will just like purchase a lot of corporate data for like $500,000, and then it's inaccurate and flawed and has a lot of issues, but then they also just really dehumanize the whole crisis by quantifying these data points. And so for us, it's really important we think about how can we put the quantitative data alongside the stories, which provide a more full picture, not the entire picture, but a little bit more of the story and what these numbers even mean, which for us often also comes in through crowdsourcing mechanisms. And so I'm going to really quickly just show the map, and then we'll also come back to this. But I can take over the screen sharing. So I think, as you can see here, this is the protections map that I described. And so we have different iconography that represents different interactive actions. So like the housing justice actions and coalitions. And we have like different ways of essentially navigating the information. So you can see like Detroit, what's happening, and different policy that is map to the policy strength. That is what these colors appear. Then the cross-hatching is the expirations. And so then there's links to different information you can add to the maps. And then on the other tab, we have, this is mostly limited to the US, just the nature of our work and where we have chapters. But we have these different oral histories, which are represented with these like pulsating location vectors. And then you can click on one and the different stories appear with like a summary and a media player. And the idea is to kind of amplify these voices. And you can also see the eviction information alongside it. So that is kind of the idea. We'll come back to some oral history listening. But now what I want to do is pass it over to Lisa, who's going to talk about how this whole design was even implemented. And sorry, I have to just get to there.
Thank you. So in the same way that we took a community-based approach to design, we also took a community-based approach to development. And so the way we did that was by employing a FOSS ideology to our software development process. So what that means is, or what FOSS refers to as free and open source software. And that boils down to free, meaning we demand freedom in the sense of ethics and essential respects for freedom to information, distribution, and desired use. And then there's the open portion of the ideology, which is referring to a demand for better quality. So anyone has the imperative to use, copy, study, or change the software however they like. The source code is openly shared, and everyone is encouraged to voluntarily improve the design of the software. In practicality, what this means is we had a GitHub repository that was open to the public. Anyone could contribute by creating an issue or submitting a pull request, and that pull request was then reviewed and merged into our code base. So we took a very democratic approach and very community-based approach to our software development. Next slide, please. Now we're going to move into our challenges and successes. Next slide, please. One of the most difficult challenges that we faced had to do with the ethical imperatives and emotional labor associated with the project. So you go into the project knowing that you can't help everyone, but you have to help everyone. This conflicting idea of the desire to help everyone you can and not spreading yourself too thin. There was definitely a significant amount of burnout amongst our members. And that had to do with the psychosocial toll of the pandemic and simply being exposed to the grief that people were enduring. Many of our members had intimate connections to people facing housing precarity. And that, of course, affected them. It affected how much work they could put into the project. So that also had to do with the amount of volunteers we had. It was difficult when members had to step away and take time to protect their mental health. Additionally, housing is part of the multi-component intervention process for preventing suicide. And it became definitely really difficult knowing how important it was to keep people housed, because it wasn't just a simple fact of, you know, this is someone's housing, which of course is important, but people's lives are truly at stake, you know, because of how housing loss can induce suicide. Next slide, please. On a more light note, we were able to we had the challenge of accessibility. We were able to address it quite successfully. So accessibility when it comes to web maps is inherently challenging due to the heavy emphasis of visual information and precise mouse movement. So that can make it difficult with people with motor disabilities and visual disabilities to use and interact with our maps. However, we incorporated alt tags and accessible rich internet applications and plain text elements to facilitate people with a wide variety of disabilities in using our maps. We also made sure to accommodate for a number of multiple screen sizes. As Brett had mentioned, many people do use pocket computers, and we wanted to make sure that when people were using them on a variety of screen sizes, that it was accessible and useful. Some challenges that we encountered were the W3C accessibility guidelines for visual accessibility regarding color and contrast. So what that means, it was difficult to maybe account for all of the ways we could make our map visually accessible in terms of color blindness, things of that nature. But But when we did have inaccessibility with language, as mentioned, we're able to successfully localize in, I believe, 12 languages, 10 to 12 languages by volunteer translators. However, the static translation does require manual updating. So as mentioned, we do have a finite amount of resources when it comes to volunteers. So having to update that can be a challenge, but we're definitely up for it, and we still are. So we're going to move on to the next slide with Luis.
Lisa, could I interrupt you and just raise a translation request to speak a little bit slower?
Sure thing.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I'll be as quick because I know that we're running short on time. But some of these things I've already mentioned before, you know, connecting with narrators when everybody was sort of sheltered in place was a challenge that we had to overcome. Conducting the interviews virtually, you know, in addition to that. And, you know, it also kind of connecting to the lack of access to the typical tools that we would utilize. And just like I don't know, I mean, there was, at a certain point, there was a lot of Zoom burnout. And I think folks just kind of wary of being stuck in these boxes for such an extended period of time. But you know, we were able to continue to work with our community partners through these formats and to support their work remotely, as you know, their work on the ground was connected to our work here in these virtual spaces. And yeah, well, I think some other things I could say, but again, we're running short on time, so I'm just going to move forward.
So some of the things that made project management difficult was that you had a shifting team of people who were available to work and who stepped in and stepped out. So we had to constantly shift like how big should meetings be? Should the research teams like work with development? And at different points in time, you had different needs. So you needed research people to talk with the developers constantly at the beginning. But then as the work became more siloed, you had to split them up, but still like maintain communication. So it was like a learning process of learning how to do that, and required like a lot of finessing, and required like some people moving into coordination roles versus like actively working on stuff. Next. So the scoring of like what's ultimately like a very qualitative like law, like what's protected, what isn't protected, into a number, into a visualization. We tried to do that in terms, as Brett was saying, in the design of like being cognizant of what cartography is. Cartography has always had military and land uses, right? That's what mapping comes from property. Mapping land comes from mapping property and taking over property. Mapping it with colors like has very specific terms. So there's still challenges in like figuring out how to do that. Was that successful? Was showing gradations of policies something that we wanted to do based on like what it represented, or what it was a political push for, or was it like based on aesthetics? So it became interesting. The last thing I would talk about is like fixing technical debt as you move from one survey into another survey form, or move from one backend into another backend form. That required a lot of manual labor. Like this stuff is not automated. Like cleaning data sets is very labor intensive work, and it has volunteer costs. So you have to be cognizant when you're doing this. It might be necessary, but it might like have other kind of costs that you're not aware of. Next. And then the other thing was just like what happens when you go from like lots of people like submitting to having to take on this labor yourself. Like this is like a much larger project. Probably hundreds of people worked on it, like at least 25 to 50 within members of the project itself. But we did hear that tenants like could found this data for themselves and use the tool. So I mean, that did make it worth. But it's I guess the question is like, how do you channel that energy when it's available without over overburdening ourselves. The other challenge is just reading through like legal data, like executive data. How do you set up those kinds of research environments, and how do you like make them language and accessible? Next. Digital prompt, Brett.
Yeah, I can speak to this. So this was just about, once we had even a map to share, like how do we make people know about it? How do we get the word out there? And then what, right? And so it's kind of this tension between not confining our own imagination as to who might use this tool or who might engage with it, and saying, oh, this tool is for these people, right? Because a lot of people have found it themselves, and maybe they wanted to join the project and because of that, or maybe they just found it and wanted to teach it in their classrooms. And so there was a lot of possibilities that we couldn't even really imagine ourselves. And so it was this challenge of designing something with this open-ended yet also specific audience, and making sure that the design was flexible enough to support all these different use cases, as well as us trying to get the word out there ourselves and reach tenants, reach policymakers, community organizers, other activists who might be activated by it. And so that was kind of on top of all the other ongoing things. And so that's really just this more like meta challenge of counter mapping in general. It's an idea, it can be a skill, it can involve like all kinds of people and relations and ways of working. And that was a huge ongoing challenge, especially when thinking about the design process, because there are many ways of doing design. Like there's design thinking, and I'm using quotes there because really it's like a racialized form of expertise that design shows up as in Silicon Valley, which really created it as a way to hijack or co-opt design and then differentiate designers from designers in Asia, and say, oh, design thinking is, that's what designers in the US can do and no one else can do that. And so there's all these different forces that can come into a project or even a design process that is counter to the spirit of counter mapping. And people might not always be cognizant of that. We did different classroom partnerships where students who are affiliated with the Stanford computer science department, for instance, brought in design thinking to our project. And that wasn't methods we wanted to use. That's not methods that we believe in. And so there were different incidents like that throughout where people might bring in more toxic technology culture or ways of approaching design and technology into what is not supposed to be a technology project. It is a counter mapping, media making, storytelling project mostly. And so that's where we see the success of bringing oral history into this work to contextualize the data, the numbers, the quantification of these experiences. And that's why we installed the multimedia player to make the data more expressive, to transmit the power of voice through the digital cartography. These were all things that I think helped the spirit of counter mapping overall. And so, yeah, I mean, it was definitely a challenge to work with the moving target eviction moratoria that was always changing. It was a challenge to navigate our own morals and values with the ill-suited tools that were at our disposal. Like we wanted to make the map compatible in as many languages as possible, but at the same time, that meant using a lot of corporate tools that were the ones available for supporting as many languages as possible, or different tools that were at our disposal, but might have questionable data ethics, or maybe even like they're using the data that we are feeding through those scripts or systems for their own, profit maximization. And so it was always this ongoing battle of like, how do we even make sense of the tools that we can use? What is possible within these very urgent time constraints? And just the temporality of all of this was really just an ongoing challenge in this very dire emergency, rapid response nature that was counter to the deliberate slowness of community building with care, and care with not just what we work and what we're making, but how we work together and what it is that we're even doing beyond that more narrow vision, but the bigger picture instead.
Yeah, and as we mentioned before, like taking it even a further like step back, like did this research need a map, or was storytelling, did storytelling require a map? Did this work require, was it a database that was necessary? What are other ways that we could have gone about like what to us was a political project, right? People wanted to do something, but what did that actually mean? Next. And so for like showing rent strikes, showing collective actions, did it build solidarity? Did it get people to find others? Could we have done like the support of tenant organizing better, collective actions better? I mean, these are still questions that I don't know. Next. Now, like what were the implicit policies of like mapping? Did places like replicate strong policies, right? Did localities look at like did one legislator look at what was going on with others and then make a different map based on that? How is that how the real world operated? I mean, I think one thing that we saw is that legislation got watered down. It got made more landlord friendly. Places that had very strong protections like immediately stepped back, and they started putting dates on moratoria that they were extending. Again, the housing crisis has only gotten worse. It is not corrected, but like these like protections have essentially been pulled back under like the real estate lobby's mobilization. Next. So I mean, this is just the real estate, like the middle picture is the California Apartment Association. They had very good representations of their policies and pushed lobbying at every local level. This is the organization that fights rent control and tenant protection bills in California. This is like what on the left is they show like the things that they have done. Like how do you, if you've already gotten money, how can you get more money? And this like the emergency tenant protections or emergency, let's say renter ERAP assistance protection, which was really a landlord bailout, right? If the landlords wanted money, they could get money. If they wanted to evict their tenants, they could refuse the money. On the right is a timeline of the National Apartment Association's federal advocacy, right? So they have this like very slick map of like what they did in fighting protections. Next. And one thing that we can also say is that like, you know, these kinds of policies, kind of half measures, these moderated policies are disorganization strategies. They keep us from organizing. So like the emergency rental assistance program, Tracy Rosenthal, who started LATU, who's very good, called like the ERAP program a disorganization policy. I would call the CDC moratorium also a disorganization policy, because suddenly local legislators can say, take a step back and say, no, our job's done. There's a federal moratorium. Whether or not a local judge or sheriff will continue an illegal protection is a different question, right? Again, these are things on paper. Do they actually lead to tenant organizing? Does it lead to keeping people in their homes? That's an open question. Next. And hopefully we have time for listening to some oral histories.
Yeah, so sorry, I hope I am still here. Yeah, so basically, if you have questions, please let us know. We were hoping for this to be more of a discussion if we have time. But I am going to quickly just at least show some of the oral histories. I don't think we have as much time to listen to them as maybe we were hoping, but I will just kind of show the breadth of stories. And maybe this will spark any questions or thoughts people have. But basically, if you come to the map, you can see that most of our stories are in California because that's where most of us are based. But we have stories that
I've been on my
talk about different struggles related to experiences or experiencing houselessness and different struggles that go on, especially during the pandemic. We have people who talk about being a single mom with 2 kids and being heartlessly evicted by people who don't care. That's what this story gets into. We have people who were just in really pandemic-y related situations where like it just stressed their income, financial insecurity, all these things threatened rent. And so debt became like a huge theme. We have stories also just about like the mental toll, the psychological toll that people experience living in these conditions. And even the intersections of housing and disability justice, where like we have a narrator here who lost a roommate because their roommate was working in the service industry and they lost their job during the pandemic, had to go back to France, lost their visa. Now this person on fixed income disability insurance doesn't have enough rent. And so these were the nature of the stories, and we would really encourage you all to listen to them. If there was time, we would do it now, but we really invite you to the map instead. And in the few minutes that we do have left, we do kind of want to just see if there are any questions, if anyone wants to raise their hand. And please let us know. We can also, I'm not sure if these are questions, but we also have a few more slides. I don't know if it even makes sense to kind of get into those.
No, I think we should open the questions now.
Well, I think just to like address Katie's comment in the chat, that's one of the things that we're always thinking about is the archiving of these stories and the archiving of these maps and how these projects can work as archives. But in that consideration, we have to think about the longevity of this work and proper storaging and how this could work for future generations. So yeah, that's something that we need to focus on more. And if there's any archivists in the room, please feel free to reach out to us.
Yeah, and Raina, did you also want to jump in there?
Well, I was just gonna see if anyone in the audience had any questions or thoughts or statements that they wanted to share, or just anything that they wanted to ask of any speakers or panelists.
We do have a question from Scott. Maybe I should just read it out. It said, you said oral history mapping makes you think of data that exists outside of typical GIS sources. Was wondering what GIS sources are, ? Thank you.
Yeah, GIS sources are also GIS is a graphical information sciences. No, geographic information sciences.
Information systems.
Geographic information systems, right? And it can be anything from demographic data, national data, things that can be joined to a map to make a spatial representation. So so any kind of quantitative information about populations, about land, about space, that can be visually represented. So like, and then there's also questions: how do we make an oral history into a geographic map? How do we make stories about political struggles into a geographic map? I think that's the question, the open question there. Any other questions? I know this was a lot of information.
Yeah, I think we're just about at time. So
Nisa asks, I was wondering what were some ways you got your map out there for people to see? Was community engagement something you were interested in doing? Yeah, well, social media was one. We talked to a lot of groups that were local groups that were involved in tenant group struggles. So those are the people who asked us to about the things that they wanted to see, like in something that was tracking this data. So disseminating through those kinds of grassroots organizations to their members. Yeah, community. I mean, more community engagement. We tried to do a lot of community engagement to get oral histories. We asked people like if people who and those groups if they had people who wanted to share their stories with us or share their stories for the public on the map. So that was how we
Yeah, and I think it's also important to know, because I didn't get to say it during the presentation, but that not only are our narrators people who are wanting to come share their stories, but we also encourage folks to do interviews and be oral historians with us. We have a huge team of people who do interviews, and it's important that we have people really committed and that kind of speak to the breadth of experience, because in oral history, you're co-creating knowledge, right? You're not just capturing one person's perspective, you're co-creating something together. And so we need to have people from all different situations, backgrounds, and identities to be doing the interviews as well. So if you're wanting to do interviews and know people who you would like to interview, please come contact us and we can incorporate them.
Yeah, thank you all. I think we're at time here, but we really appreciate your attention and for joining us. If you're interested in the anti-eviction mapping project or any of our resources, please do reach out. I can drop my email in here. We also have our general email contact form on the website. But yes, please do get in touch with us. We are also at anti-eviction map on Twitter. So follow us and we hope to stay in touch with you all and see your presentations as well. Thank you.
Can we share our slides?
Yeah, I think so.
What would be the best way to do that, Cal?
I would send them to your AMC staff contact, whoever you were coordinating setting up your session with, and they would be able to set it up to the people who registered. Or if you have it linked, I can put it in the Excel events chat for this. I'm not sure how long that will stay open though.
I'm just going to put the link in the chat for people, and then we can say have a good day.
If I recorded this, where do I go back to get the recording?
The recording should be posted on Excel events. When you go to see the previous sessions in the agenda, it'll have a link to the recording.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you to William and Kel as well. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for the interpretation.
Oh, I think William left, but
Thank you, everyone.
yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Let's wrap.
Debrief later.
That's good.
Hey, what happened with my slides? Who did that? My slides was completely out of order. Who did that? Who did that?
We're out of order. I kept the
They're
order
fine.
in bed.
They were out of
no?
order, man.
One I merged. There was just one. I put the three together. But you sent me two versions, maybe. I don't know.
Oh, he threw me so off.
I think in the future, if you're going to do this presentation again, Brett, your design should go in the front because it gives a more of an overview, and then we like jumped into